Here is something nobody tells you about being lied about. The lie doesn't arrive with accusations or confrontations or a moment you can point to and say, "That's when it started." It seeps in. Through a shorter phone call, a dinner that gets rescheduled one time too many, a look across a table that lasts a half-second longer than it should. By the time you understand what's been happening, the person telling the lie has had months of uncontested access to the one person whose opinion of you mattered most. And the person you love has already started to believe it. Welcome back to Father's Revenge Stories. Pour your coffee, pull up a chair, and remember, the most dangerous men don't react to betrayal with anger. They react by quietly closing all your exits. Drop a comment, hit subscribe. Let's watch them learn the hard way. My name is Dennis Holt. I am 62 years old, retired civil engineer, and for 4 years I was slowly erased from my daughter's life by a man she trusted more than she trusted the evidence in front of her own eyes. I want to be clear about something before we go any further. I am not angry about it anymore. The anger had its season, and then it passed. What I have now is something steadier. But I will get to that. Let me tell you about Audrey first. Audrey Grace Holt is 33 years old, and she is, without any attempt at objectivity on my part, one of the most perceptive people I have ever known. She reads rooms the way some people read books, fast, instinctively, retaining everything. She got her mother Sandra's stubbornness, which is both her greatest quality and the thing that made the next 4 years possible. Audrey commits. When she decides something is true, she holds it with both hands. That's a strength until someone figures out how to use it as a lever. Sandra passed 8 years ago. Breast cancer, aggressive, 14 months from diagnosis to the end. Audrey was 25. There is a specific kind of recalibration that happens between a father and daughter when they become each other's nearest family, and we went through it. Quietly and without a formal agreement, the way you navigate something that doesn't come with instructions. We talked more. We showed up more. Not because we made a pact about it, but because we both understood, without needing to say it, that what was left was worth not taking for granted. For 6 years after Sandra died, Audrey and I talked twice a week. Every Sunday without fail, and usually once more midweek when something happened that one of us needed to tell the other about. She came to dinner on the last Sunday of every month. She called me from parking lots after first dates, after job interviews, after hard days at work. I was the first person she told when she got the promotion she'd been working toward for 3 years. I was the first person she called when that promotion turned out to be considerably more stress than advertised. We had a rhythm, a real one, the kind that doesn't feel like effort because it isn't. Then she met Marcus Cole. I'm going to tell you about Marcus carefully, because accuracy matters here more than making him into a simple villain. Marcus Cole is a commercial real estate broker, polished, well-networked, the kind of man who has been told his whole life that he is exceptional and has built his entire personality around that fact. He was, when I first met him, genuinely engaging, good in conversation, attentive to Audrey in a way that was visible without being theatrical. He asked me questions about my work with the focused attention of a man who has been taught that listening is a skill you deploy, not a habit you develop. I didn't dislike him. What I had, and I want to be honest about this rather than rewriting it after the fact, was an unease I couldn't source. The kind you don't mention because you can't point to anything specific. I mentioned it to Lou anyway. Lou Peterson has been my closest friend for 26 years, since we coached youth baseball together when our kids were small. Lou is a direct man who has never in his life softened a thought before handing it to you. He told me plainly that I'd had a feeling about every man Audrey ever dated. I acknowledged that was fair. He said it probably didn't mean anything. I told him he was probably right. We were both partially correct, which is the most dangerous kind of wrong. Audrey and Marcus got engaged 2 years after they met. She called me from the car outside the restaurant where it happened, still crying in the specific way she cries when she's overwhelmed rather than sad, in bursts, laughing between them. I told her I was happy for her. I told her Marcus was a lucky man. Both of those things were true. The wedding was the following May. An outdoor venue with old oak trees and string lights and the kind of late afternoon light that makes everyone in photographs look like the best version of themselves. I walked her down the aisle, and at the end of it, she squeezed my arm once, hard, the way she'd grabbed my hand as a little girl whenever something was important. I held myself together, barely. I want to be precise about what I said to Marcus on that wedding day, because this precision will matter later. During the reception, while Audrey was dancing with her college friends, Marcus and I were briefly standing near each other by the edge of the lawn. He handed me a drink. I thanked him, and I said, "She is the best thing I ever did. Make sure she stays that way." That is the complete and exact conversation. One sentence. He raised his glass. We watched her dance. That was it. 8 months after the wedding, Audrey stopped calling on Sundays. Not immediately. The first missed Sunday, she texted that it had been a crazy week and could they talk Tuesday. Tuesday came and went. Then a Sunday call that lasted 9 minutes instead of 50. Then a canceled dinner, then another. I did what I had decided I was going to do. I did not push. I held my pattern and watched to see if she would return to hers. She didn't. By month 6, I knew it wasn't scheduling. The rhythm we'd built over 6 years doesn't dissolve over scheduling. Scheduling is an excuse, not an explanation. Something had changed, and the change had a shape to it. The calls weren't just shorter, they were different in quality. She was present but measured, answering exactly what I asked and not beyond it. The spontaneous calls, the parking lot calls, the ones that started with, "You will not believe what just happened," those had stopped entirely. I called Lou on a Thursday evening. He said, "Have you asked her directly?" "Not yet." "Why not?" I thought about it honestly. Because if I ask and she says something I'm not ready to hear, I can't unhear it. Lou was quiet for a moment. Then, "Dennis, you're going to hear it eventually. The only question is whether you hear it from her or you spend another 6 months watching it happen from a distance." A pause. "Call her." I called the following Sunday. I told her I'd noticed we'd been less connected lately and asked plainly whether I'd done something I wasn't aware of. What she said next is the sentence that started 4 years of silence. "Dad," she said, quiet for a moment before she continued, "Marcus told me about a conversation you had with him at the wedding." I waited. "He said you pulled him aside and told him that you had serious doubts about the marriage, that you thought he had a pattern with women, that you'd looked into his background and didn't like what you found." I sat with that. "Audrey, I said one sentence to Marcus at your wedding." "Dad, one sentence. I told him you were the best thing I ever did and to make sure you stayed that way. That is every word of that conversation." She was quiet. "That is not what he told me," she said. Careful, not accusatory, but not convinced. "I know it isn't," I said, "because what he told you isn't true." Longer silence. Then, "He also told me you've been asking questions about him, to people in our lives, that you've been raising concerns behind my back." I had told Lou about my unease. One person, one honest conversation. Whatever Marcus had constructed from that, or fabricated entirely, I couldn't know. "Audrey," I said. "Think about why I would do any of that and not come to you directly." "He said you thought I'd defend him." And there it was, an answer pre-built for every counter-argument I had. I could deny it, and the denial had already been filed away as exactly what she'd been told I would do. I had no evidence. I had only my word, and my word, in that moment, had already been outweighed by something I'd had no chance to defend against. How do you prove a conversation that had no witnesses? I spent 4 years trying to answer that question. Stay with me. If you've made it this far, do us one quick favor. Subscribe. A lot of people watch without ever doing it, but it costs you nothing and means everything to us. Thank you, genuinely. I am not going to describe the next 4 years as a summary. A summary makes it sound managed. It wasn't managed. It happened in real time, slowly, with long stretches of ordinary days between the moments that mattered, and that is how it should be told. Year 1. I adjusted my expectations downward and told myself it was a phase. Newlyweds compact their worlds. I chose to believe that because the alternative required more from me than I was ready for. Around that time, about 10 months after the wedding, I ran into a man named Brian Schaefer at an industry dinner. Commercial development, mostly. We'd worked a project together years earlier and stayed in loose touch the way professionals do when they respect each other's work without having reason to keep in closer contact. We caught up over bad chicken and decent wine. I mentioned Audrey had just gotten married. He asked what her husband did. I said commercial real estate, downtown market mostly. Brian nodded slowly. Said he moved in those circles occasionally. Said if he ever crossed paths with Marcus Cole, he'd let me know what he thought. I told him I appreciated that, said it lightly, and meant it sincerely. We shook hands. I drove home and didn't think about it again for 3 years. Year 2. The adjustment became acceptance, and acceptance was worse. It has a finality that hope doesn't have. You stop waiting for the thing to change and start learning the shape of the thing as it is. There was one Sunday in year 2, Audrey's birthday, August. I had sent a card and a framed photograph, the 3 of us at the coast, the summer before Sandra died, one of the last photographs where we are all exactly ourselves. I thought she would want it. She texted me a thank you at 7:14 that evening. 14 words. I noticed that I counted them, and I noticed that the counting was something I had started doing without deciding to. I called Lou that night. He picked up and said before I'd said a word, "How are you doing?" 14 words, I said. He didn't answer immediately. Then, "Dennis, I want to go over there and—" "Lou, I know. We're not doing that." "I know." A pause. "It's just, I've known that girl since she was 9 years old. I taught her to throw a curveball. She calls me Uncle Lou. And some man she's known for 3 years has her looking at her own father like, 'Lou.'" "I know." Quietly. "I know." We sat on the phone in silence for a while. That is something you can only do with someone you have known long enough that silence doesn't require explanation. Eventually I said, "If I go in swinging, I'm playing on his terms. She doesn't have evidence that I'm telling the truth. She only has his version. If I attack his version without proof, I look like exactly what he told her I was." Lou said, "So what do you do?" "I stay exactly who I am," I said. "I don't change. I don't escalate. I don't pull back. I just stay." He thought about that. "That's the hardest thing you've said yet." "Yes," I said. "It is." Year 3 is where I almost broke the rule I'd set for myself. Marcus called me directly in October of that year. It was the only time in 4 years he ever reached out. His voice was warm in the way it always was. Practiced, surface-level warm. He said he wanted to check in, see how I was doing. Said Audrey mentioned I'd seemed a little down lately. Said he was glad she had a father who cared so much, that it meant a lot to both of them. That he hoped I understood they were just in a busy season of life. I held the phone for a long moment. He was warning me. That was the entire purpose of the call. Delivered in the language of concern, wrapped in the performance of a devoted son-in-law, but underneath it there was a message. I see you, and you're not getting any closer. When I hung up, Lou asked what I was going to do. If you were me, what would you have done with that phone call? Nothing, I said. Dennis, nothing, I repeated. He called because he's watching me. If I react, he uses it. So I'm going to be exactly what he doesn't know what to do with. I'm going to be nothing but good. Lou was quiet for a long time. That's the coldest thing I've ever heard you say. Good, I said. Year 4, I stayed. I sent the cards. I showed up to the things I was invited to, which were fewer every year, without complaint. I never said a negative word about Marcus to Audrey, because any attack on him, no matter how warranted, would land as confirmation of the story he'd already told. At the twice-yearly dinners we shared, I watched him play the gracious son-in-law, refilling drinks, asking about my work, performing warmth with the consistency of someone who has been doing it long enough that he no longer notices the performance. In my worst moments, I wondered if I had constructed the entire thing. If I was the difficult father-in-law who couldn't step back and let his daughter live. Then I'd go back to that one sentence I'd said at the wedding. The gap between that sentence and what Audrey had been told was not a misunderstanding. That gap had an author. The mistake happened in November, year 4. Marcus had been working toward a senior partnership at his firm, the kind of promotion that requires not just performance, but relationships, the right clients, the right impressions, the right version of yourself on display. He had been cultivating a property developer named Brian Schaefer, whose portfolio was significant enough that landing him would shift Marcus's trajectory considerably. They met for a working lunch. Brian Schaefer records all his business meetings, disclosed at the start of every session, used for his own note-taking. He has done this for 15 years. It is unremarkable, routine, and on that Tuesday, it became the most consequential habit of his professional life. Brian remembered my name. He mentioned it warmly during the lunch, the way you mention someone you trust, to establish common ground with someone you're still deciding about. Marcus took a half beat. Then he said, Dennis Holt, yeah, my father-in-law. Complicated situation, honestly. Good man in some ways, but he's had a hard time since his wife passed. My wife's had to create some distance. A lot of it his own doing, from what I understand. Brian called me that evening. He said, I'm going to send you something. I want you to know before you hear it that you deserve to know. I said, Brian, in the 6 years you've known me, have I given you any reason to think what he described is accurate? He said, Dennis, that's exactly why I'm calling. The file arrived while we were still on the phone. I played it once. Then I sat in my kitchen for a while. Then I played it again. Not because I needed a second listen to understand it, because I needed to be certain of what I had before I moved. I had spent 4 years watching the absence of evidence work against me, and I was not going to be careless with the first real piece of it. I called Lou. I told him about the recording. I read him the transcript. Lou was quiet for a moment. Then he said, He did this in a recorded professional meeting. Yes. From his own mouth. Yes. Dennis. I heard him exhale. That man has been lying about you inside his own house for 4 years, where there were no witnesses. This time, there was a witness, and the witness had a microphone. I said, I need you to think about whether you know anyone in his professional world who might have heard something similar. I need to know whether this is a habit. Lou said, give me 2 days. He came back in 36 hours with 2 names. A former colleague of Marcus's who recalled dismissive comments about a difficult father-in-law at a company event. A property manager who had heard similar language during a post-closing dinner. Neither had thought much of it at the time. Both were willing to put it in writing when Lou explained the situation. I met with an attorney named Carol Waverly, a former mediator who now handled family and civil matters. She listened to the full account without interrupting, which told me she was either very patient or already ahead of me. Carol is never without something to say. When I finished, she said, "What do you want from this?" "I want my daughter to have accurate information," I said. "That's the only thing I want. No lawsuit, no formal action. Audrey makes her own decisions. I just want to make sure she's making them with the truth." Carol looked at me for a moment. Then, "All right. Let me put together something she can hold in her hands." What we assembled was simple by design. Brian's transcript with a printed copy alongside the audio link. 2 written statements, signed and dated. A single-page summary in plain language. No legal framing, no dramatic structure. Just a clear, sourced sequence of what could be documented. I wanted Audrey reading a conversation, not a case. I called her on a Wednesday and asked if she'd meet me for lunch. Just us. She agreed with the careful quality she'd developed around me over 4 years, the particular guardedness I had watched grow and had never once stopped finding painful. We met at a diner I'd taken her to throughout her childhood. She used to order the same thing every visit until she was 15 and decided she was too old for that, and then she turned 20 and went back to it. She was having it when I arrived. That small thing, for reasons I can't fully explain, steadied me. I sat down across from her. I put the folder on the table. "I need you to read this," I said, "all of it, while I'm sitting here." She looked at the folder, then at me. "What is it?" "Documentation," I said, "about what has been said about me and where it's been said. I need you to read it now." She opened it. She read it. I watched her face, and I will not describe what moved through it, because that belonged to her. What I will tell you is that she read it twice, the second time slower than the first. When she set the last page down, she was very still. The diner went on around us, dishes and voices and the bell above the door, and she sat in the middle of it without moving. Finally, "This is Brian Schaefer's recording." "Yes." "You didn't set this up." "He called me. He'd known me 6 years. He thought I should hear it." She read one of the written statements a second time. "How long has he been doing this?" 4 years that I can document," I said. "I believe it started earlier." She set the papers down deliberately, the way she does when something is landing hard and she needs her hands to do something while the rest of her catches up. Then she looked up at me, and what she said next, I wasn't prepared for it, even though I'd been sitting across from her for 20 minutes waiting. "He called you once," she said, "year 3. Told me afterward that you sounded great, that it seemed like you were finally adjusting." I nodded. "He didn't tell me he'd called to check on you. He framed it like you'd reached out." She stopped. I remember thinking it was good, that you were moving forward. She pressed her lips together. He told me that story the same week I'd started to wonder if something was wrong. That is the sentence that made 4 years make sense to me. Not the recording, not the written statements. That. The week she'd started to wonder, Marcus had already moved to close the door. I need to tell you something, I said, and I need you to hear it the way I mean it. I am not telling you this to be right. I am not telling you this to make you choose anything or to put you in the middle of something. I'm telling you because you're my daughter, and you deserved this information 4 years ago, and I didn't have it then. She looked at me. The conversation at the wedding, I said, the one he described to you. I said one sentence to Marcus Cole at your reception. I told him you were the best thing I ever did, and to make sure you stayed that way. That is every word. She closed her eyes. We sat in that diner for a long time. The coffee went cold and got refilled. The waitress looked at our faces once and walked away without asking anything, which was the right call. Eventually, Audrey said, "I kept thinking something felt wrong. I know you, Dad. I kept getting close to that feeling, and then there would be something else he'd said, another thing to weigh it against." She stopped. He was very patient about it. "I know," I said. "I should have trusted Audrey." I waited until she looked at me. "You trusted your husband. That is not something that needs an apology." Her eye caught the light. She wiped it quickly, the way she hopes I won't notice, which I always do, and she knows I always do. "I missed you," she said. I had spent 4 years counting words, and those 2 were the only count that ever mattered. "I was here," I said. "I never left." What happened between Audrey and Marcus after that afternoon is hers to tell, not mine. What I know is that she confronted him with the recording the same evening. He tried several approaches: context, misrepresentation, the claim that venting privately to a client was not the same as a campaign. Each version collapsed because she had the transcript, and the transcript said exactly what it said, in his voice, with no room for revision. And when she brought up the phone call, the one he'd told her I'd made, the one he'd actually made himself, he had nothing. There is no version of a lie that survives that particular light. They separated a month later. The divorce took 10 months. It was not easy. Separations built on years of deliberate dishonesty rarely are. But it was thorough. Audrey called me on the weekend she moved into a new apartment. 17 boxes, no assembled furniture, a strong opinion about which Thai place delivered to her zip code. I drove over. Lou appeared without being called, the way he does when things matter, and spent 40 minutes assembling a bookshelf while providing a continuous editorial on the instruction diagrams that I will not reproduce here in full. We ordered Thai food and sat on the floor because the couch hadn't arrived. Audrey talked about the 4 years from her side, the things Marcus had said, the way he'd said them, the patient layering of it. When she finished, she leaned her head against the wall and said, "I feel like I was living in a house built on the wrong foundation and just walked outside and looked at it." I said, "The good news is you can see it now." "Because he got careless," she said. 4 years of careful and then one lunch with the wrong person. "People like Marcus stop being careful eventually," I said. "Not because they become careless, because they become comfortable. And comfortable and careful don't live in the same house for long. She thought about that. Then she said, "I want you to know that I know what those 4 years cost you. Not pushing, not forcing it." I said, "It cost about what I expected." "Which was?" "More than I wanted," I said, "and less than losing you entirely." She reached over and took my hand. One firm squeeze, the exact grip she'd used at the altar on her wedding day. Lou, across the room, said without looking up from the bookshelf, "Are you two going to do this all night, or can someone help me figure out where step 7 went?" Audrey laughed. I laughed. The bookshelf got finished. I've thought a long time about what the true lesson is here. It is not about patience as a strategy, though patience was necessary. It is not about waiting for people to make mistakes, though that is what happened. It is about something simpler and harder than either of those things. You cannot control what someone says about you in a room you are not in. You cannot argue against a conversation that had no witnesses. You cannot force belief from someone who has been carefully steered away from it. The only thing you can control is who you actually are over time. And who you actually are over time either matches the lie or it doesn't. Marcus could tell Audrey her father was cold, difficult, resentful, unable to let go. But he couldn't make me those things. Every card I sent, every dinner I showed up to, every call I answered, every moment I didn't push or pressure or demand, that was evidence that needed no recording. The recording just gave her permission to look at what had been there all along. And when she told me about the week she'd started to wonder, that week in year 3 when something in her had been ready to question the story, I understood that she had never fully believed it. Not completely. She'd been holding a doubt she couldn't name, and Marcus had moved the instant he felt it. He ran out of moves in a diner, over coffee that went cold twice, while his father-in-law sat across from him in a folder of his own words. We talk twice a week again. She calls from parking lots. Last month she called me from the driveway after a first date and talked for 45 minutes, and I sat in my kitchen and listened to every word like it was the most important thing that had happened to me in years. Because it was. That is what was taken. That is what came back. And if you ask me whether the patience was worth it, I will tell you I don't think of patience as payment. I think of it as the only proof I had that the lie was a lie. I stayed who I was. In the end, that was the only thing that needed to be true. Before I go, I want to say something directly to anyone listening who might be in Audrey's position right now. Not Dennis's, Audrey's. Because the truth is, most of us are never the one being lied about. We're the one being slowly convinced. There are 3 things I wish someone had told my daughter earlier. The first is this: pay attention to timing. Marcus called me the exact week Audrey had started to wonder. That was not a coincidence. When someone who controls information senses you pulling away, they move fast. If the person you're with suddenly becomes more attentive, more reassuring, right when you're starting to question something, notice that. Comfort offered at the exact moment doubt appears is not always kindness. Sometimes it's management. The second, notice who does the talking when you're with your family. Not what they say. Who fills the silence? Who answers for you before you've finished thinking? Who summarizes the conversation on the drive home? The person doing the most talking is also doing the most shaping. The third is the hardest one. If every time you try to voice a doubt, there is already an explanation waiting, one that makes you feel guilty for doubting in the first place, that explanation did not arrive by accident. Genuine reassurance leaves room for your question. Manufactured reassurance closes the door before you finish knocking. Audrey is one of the sharpest people I know. It still took 4 years. That's not a failure of intelligence. That's what patient, deliberate manipulation looks like from the inside. It doesn't feel like a trap. It feels like love. If something feels wrong, it's worth one honest conversation with someone outside the house. If you liked this story, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more real, raw, and family-centered stories. And as always, thank you for being a part of this.